Ambassador Michelle Gavin has served as staff director for the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on African Affairs, as special assistant to President Obama, and the senior director for Africa at the National Security Council. She is a Rhodes Scholar who has previously served as the United States ambassador to Botswana and launched one of the largest HIV research initiatives in the world. She is currently the senior fellow for African Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and has published frequently on Africa's response to COVID-19. Dr. Paul Angelo is a Council on Foreign Relations expert on Latin America. He is a Naval Academy graduate and Rhodes Scholar who during his naval career frequently deployed to Latin America and served as the U.S. Embassy's principal liaison to the Colombian military and police. He currently serves as a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and recently published in New York Times on China, Latin America, and COVID-19. Dr. Yanzhong Huang is an expert on global health issues and China and is the author of Governing Health in Contemporary China. He is currently a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he directs the Global Health Governance Roundtable series. He is also a professor and director of global health studies and is the founding editor of the Global Health Governance Journal. He has recently authored numerous CFR essays and reports on China's response to COVID-19. Moderating the panel is First Class Andrew Walsh, a quantitative economics major who serves as the co-director of the conference for academic content.
So hello and welcome to our distinguished panelists. I would like to start by extending our gratitude to you all on behalf of the United States Naval Academy and the Naval Academy's Foreign Affairs Conference. It means so much to us to have you all here today. And without much hesitation, I'd like to jump right into the first question, if that's okay with everyone. And so when dealing with pandemics, if it is possible at all, how would you all define success?
So I'll start. I think that it's actually a really challenging question because you could lay out, purely health indicators, sort of number of deaths or hospitalizations or avoiding your health system getting overrun. But for many countries, certainly in Africa, which is the region that I work on, the economic effects of the pandemic are completely devastating, just in terms of unemployment, even filtering into food security. So another sort of issue of survival. So I think that, for a lot of citizens, success would be not losing ground in terms of their sort of socioeconomic well-being, in addition to not feeling, that their life is at risk from the virus itself.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Michelle on this one. There are very few countries around the world today that are in the clear when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I would say that success first depends on your time horizons, but also on your frame of reference, as Michelle noted. Are we talking about health indicators? Are we talking about economic resilience or contraction? Are we talking about government-citizen relations? Or are we even talking about geostrategic competition and the ability of major powers to use COVID-19 medical diplomacy as a way to expand their soft power influence globally? We can certainly look to countries like Australia, Taiwan, New Zealand as countries that took early preventative action and that have really been of great benefit to their populations and to their economies. But those are countries that also benefit from some very unique geographic conditions by comparison to other leading democracies in the world. When I look at my own region of interest, Latin America, my initial appraisal of government performance on the issue of COVID-19 had a lot to do with how seriously public health officials were taking things like the extension of PPE to their populations or the enforcement of social distancing. And at the time, one of the standout examples was Peru. But if you look a year later at indicators in Peru, it is showing the worst economic contraction globally for 2020. I think the economic contraction was upwards of 12%. And it's also the country in the world with the highest COVID-19 death rate. So that's all to say that I think it's really just too early to tell whether countries have been successful or not, especially some countries right now are facing their third wave of contagion and deaths.
Yeah, well, I agree with my two esteemed colleagues, but in terms of the approaches to define success, certainly if success can be defined in terms of the congruence between policy objectives and policy outcomes, right? So if we are talking about the ability to contain the virus spread in a relatively short period of time, then you might point to China as example of success, right? Because it contained the virus, spread within 10 weeks, and sustained that very low level of infection ever since. But there is an alternative, what sometimes I would like to call the procedural approach to assess the policy success. Well, that is the approach that focuses on investigating whether policy is pursued in ways that is consistent with the procedures called for in the policy. So that alternative approach become, I think, particularly useful if we consider this final goal being completely breaking the virus transmission chain and ending the pandemic globally. Right. So here the timeline becomes relevant, right, and important, right? China's comparative success, now become relative if we use the ability to achieve herd immunity as a goal, right? If you compare China with the United States, for example, the United States now has administered more than 133 million doses of vaccines, with 26% of the population being administered with at least with one dose of vaccines. In China, even though it has administered more than 91 million doses, still that only covered 6.6% of its population. Right. So this approach, I think, makes this timeline, that the final goal we talk about important, and it also allows us to look at the second order issues associated with policy implementation. So if a success is achieved with draconian measures, that causes disruption in the economy, widespread violation of human rights, and making access to routine health care even difficult, then it may not be the most desirable approach there.
Absolutely, Dr. Huang. And to your point, I'd like to ask a follow-up question. In terms of the timeline in defining success, is it possible for countries to sort of realize early success only to see maybe their economic recovery become a failure or drop the ball later on?
Well, we have seen, right, that China, right, it has been not only able to contain the virus spread in a relatively short period of time, it is only the major economy, right, that registered positive growth, right? So, this too doesn't have to be the two different conflicting policy goals.
Yeah, I would just note that, early on in the pandemic, there was a reasonable amount of attention to how successful most African states had been in avoiding the kinds of infection numbers that you were seeing in Europe and the United States, and certainly deaths. And there were lots of reasons for that. Youthful demographics, we know, right, that older people are particularly vulnerable, but also a set of countries that have a lot of experience with infectious disease outbreaks, right? Most notably Ebola, where a set of governments have learned to work together quickly to get public health measures in place very quickly. And a lot of African states acted even before they had their first confirmed case. So there was lots of talk about African success. But now what we're seeing is that the second wave that hit the continent has been dramatically worse than the first. Countries have been less willing to take dramatic public health measures because of the economic impact and, frankly, then the political fallout. You've seen mass demonstrations and a lot of popular dissatisfaction with governments because of the kind of constrained economic space that people have to operate in when there are these public health restrictions. So yes, in short, you can have kind of early success, but that doesn't mean that everything's going to go well. And now, of course, the challenge of vaccinating a continent where right now, right, there's over 1 billion people on the African continent, about 7 million have been vaccinated.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Michelle said, and much of it is applicable to the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I would just add that Latin America is a region of the world that has been most deeply affected in economic terms by the COVID-19 pandemic. A regional economic contraction for 2020 was at 7.7%. Countries like Argentina and Peru were seeing double-digit GDP contractions for the year. And it's really, despite the fact that many of these governments took very seriously the public health challenge that they were confronting, they hadn't really been able, weren't really able to implement policies that were going to allow the economies to putter along despite lockdowns and severe social distancing regimes. And so if you're to ask people broadly across the region, how they feel about their government's response today, many of them will express frustration simply because the economic situation is so dire.
Absolutely. And Dr. Angelo, you made an earlier point about it might be too early to tell which countries have been successful in dealing with the pandemic. But I'd like to pose this, and please answer if you can. But we've seen multiple different types of strategies as to how countries deal with the pandemic. We've seen New Zealand's early and effective action. We've seen Sweden's sort of unofficial quest for herd immunity, and Brazil had sort of a dismissive attitude at first towards this disease. So if you had to choose an example as to which response has been most successful and had the most sustained success, which would it be? Yeah,
in the Latin America, Caribbean region, I would point to two contenders there, Chile and Uruguay. I would start with Uruguay simply because it was a country that, despite the trauma that most of the rest of the world was dealing with for most of 2020, Uruguay had very, very low numbers in terms of infections and deaths. However, that was and it was only doing so, it was maintaining such low numbers through responsible public health messaging to its population, which is among the most educated populations, national populations throughout Latin America, but also through border closures. Nonetheless, we're seeing that with these new strains of the virus that have really taken hold in much of South America in particular, the greater risk of infection throughout, that Uruguay's responsible strategy, despite the fact that it was showing real promise, may have some holes in it. In fact, this past week, Uruguay set a daily record for the highest number of COVID cases in any given day since the beginning of the pandemic. Likewise, I would point to Chile, which has done a phenomenal job at vaccinating its population. It has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, just behind Israel and the United Arab Emirates, at vaccinating 47 out of per 100 inhabitants of the country, which is significantly more generous than the number 2 contender, which is Brazil, which to date has only vaccinated 7 per every 100 inhabitants. But nonetheless, again, we're seeing a serious rise in cases and in particular in deaths in a country like Chile. This week, the critical bed occupancy in Chile was at 95%. And the government is once again having to take very drastic measures to ensure social distancing and has started enforcing yet again a lockdown in Santiago. So, in terms of good performers, I would say Uruguay and Chile had demonstrated some real leadership and had shown some real positive results, but they're not in the clear yet.
Well, I think if we use the number of newly infected cases and mortalities as a yardstick to measure the effectiveness of a country's response, it appears that some countries indeed more successful than others, right, in addressing the pandemic. Well, these countries include, in addition to Chile, Paraguay, as Paul just alluded to, they also include New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, Vietnam, China, and Singapore. A lot of other countries are not doing well, but that include Brazil and the United States. But as we know about this, the successful countries indeed have something in common, right? That is, they all adopt a strategy that includes rapid response, mass testing, aggressive contact tracing, the effective social distancing, and if necessary, mass quarantine, even lockdown measures. And if you look at the countries like Sweden, right, Brazil was a laissez-faire, dismissive approach. Right, appeal doesn't work. Right, the Sweden is a good example. It has 10 million people. Even they pursue this, the natural herd immunity approach, it still led to more than 13,000 deaths. That is 3 times of China's, the death total. and then 780,000 infections. That's 7.8% of the population. That is also far from enough to achieve the herd immunity as well.
Yeah, I find this question challenging to answer because throughout the continent, I can point to successful strategies and successful interventions. But since no one's out of the woods yet, and this issue of vaccine access really has been unresolved for the entire region, I think it's very hard to call any case at this point a success. There's just a tremendous gap in access to what finally sort of closes out this chapter. But I would point to a country like Ghana as an example of, a government that has, through kind of multiple waves, done a great job with public education campaigns, reaching out to voices of authority beyond just public health officials or government officials. Gotten the screening and testing procedures right. There's a lot to admire and a lot to learn, particularly in West Africa, from states that have used community health workers who are used in, say, polio vaccination campaigns or to deal with other infectious diseases, pivoting those people very quickly to work on this crisis. There are a lot of fascinating models, but there is no country that's, getting close to the kinds of vaccination rates that would lead you to herd immunity and to a period where you don't have to be planning for this crisis in the future.
Certainly. And I know you spoke a little bit on some successful strategies that you could identify. Is there any way that you could identify some unsuccessful strategies that you've seen across various nations?
You bet I can. So denial is a terrible strategy, I think, around the world, right? And I think we had some experience with it here in the United States. But if you look at a country like Tanzania, who just lost their president, President Magufuli passed away probably due to COVID. We'll probably never know with certainty, but he was convinced that Tanzania would be protected from the virus by God. He, eschewed access to COVAX, the conglomerate that's supposed to help provide vaccine access for a lot of the developing world. And, Tanzanians were forced to kind of engage in subterfuge and midnight burials to deal with casualties of the pandemic. So this, sort of pushing the problem underground, creating confusion and more opportunities for misinformation, which is a big piece of this story, I think, globally as well, just as it is here in the United States. There are plenty of conspiracy theories, inaccurate public health information. It makes it worse, right, when public officials are not forthright and honest about the situation that they face. So that's the example that leaps to mind for me.
Yeah, Andrew, I would pick up on what Michelle said. I think there are a number of major and widely publicized cases in Latin America and the Caribbean where government leaders and particularly presidents have engaged in denial of the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic and of the disease. And I would point to the two largest economies and two most populous countries in Latin America, Brazil and Mexico, in which you have two populist presidents who have denigrated from the very earliest days common sense public health precautions to include wearing a mask. And really, I think there was a calculation that between closing the economy and saving lives, or keeping the economy going and sacrificing a significant percentage of the population. And what's interesting in both cases, you have presidents who are operating within a federal system. And so by not closing down the national economy or by not enforcing lockdown regimes throughout the country, both presidents pushed that kind of responsibility to subnational authorities. And we saw in both countries, there were actually major public bouts, rhetorical bouts between presidents and governors, for instance, who may have been taking the COVID-19 threat more seriously. But the reality is that in neither case have the economies, despite the fact that they've largely remained open, been proven resilient. In fact, Mexico's economic contraction is upwards of 8% for 2020. Likewise, we've seen significant gaps in data and systematic underreporting, most prominently in Mexico. For 2020, there were more than 300,000 excess deaths that many suspect were actually COVID deaths, but aren't being included in official tallies. And then in a country like Brazil, we've seen the Minister of Health rotate out 3 times since the pandemic started due to public disputes with President Bolsonaro, who has himself used his platform to spread disinformation or misinformation concerning the severity of the virus, but also the efficacy of the vaccinations that are being rolled out in the country. In fact, President Bolsonaro has only recently tempered his tone vis-a-vis COVID-19, now that his primary opponent in the presidential race next year, former President Lula, has started encouraging people to take the pandemic seriously. And so President Bolsonaro has responded in kind and has uttered his first sort of very common sense rhetoric about the dealing with the pandemic to the population, because he recognizes that his performance on COVID-19 may serve to be a liability for him in the 2022 elections.
Dr. Angelo, you said something very interesting there about elected officials having to choose between, which blow that they're willing to take, economic or public health. So pulling on that thread a little bit, I'd like to pose the questions: are democracies just inherently ill-equipped to handle crises?
I think if this pandemic actually informs us anything, is that the state-based collective action remains critical, right, in pandemic control. Right, so Francis Fukuyama published an article in Foreign Affairs, basically talking about how this initial phases of the emergency were a brutal political test, in his words, that only a handful of countries passed, right? Essentially those with capable states, social trust, and effective leadership, right? So basically, other things being equal, right? The virus is indeed sensitive, to a centralized political structure, right? This CFR task force report on the pandemic pointed out that compared to a federalist structure, the top-down authoritarian system seems to be more likely, right, to galvanize the commitment, the resources to address the highly transmissible, potentially lethal virus. But from a historical perspective, overall, I think liberal democracies handle the disease outbreaks better, than their authoritarian counterparts. Now, even in this pandemic, as we just say about Taiwan and New Zealand, they are actually doing pretty well, actually, in terms of its ability to balance, protecting public health, right, protecting people's health and minimizing the disruption to the economy and society. I think they have performed even better than China. So I think what matters, again, as Fukuyama suggested, is the state capacity, leadership, and social trust, and not regime types. So one important trait of the democracies is this function of civil society, right? I just give you the example, right, that in New York, right, when the pandemic hit, within days after Governor Andrew Cuomo appealed for healthcare workers to come to the city and help fight the outbreak, 40,000 volunteers sign up, right, within just days. So that was actually close to the number of healthcare workers the Chinese state had mobilized nationwide to support Wuhan.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about the role that civil society plays, and particularly the point you made about social trust, because there is a lot of research that suggests whatever flavor of public health crisis, right, social trust is essential to effectively mobilizing people to address it, particularly if it involves behavior change, sacrifices on their part. And so yeah, it's functioning states that people have confidence in, right? That are going to be able to respond more effectively in that sense. I do think that some of the more open and liberal, in the political science sense, not in the American political sense, liberal regimes on the continent of Africa show us that their comfort level with other voices of authority in society has been a boon to their efforts to address COVID-19, because they're unafraid to reach out to religious leaders, to reach out to cultural leaders, and try and draw them in to a campaign to mobilize the population. And that can be a much more difficult and dicey thing in places where leadership is insecure, right? And afraid of elevating other voices that could be seen as competitive. The other thing I would just say briefly on this is that the relationship between democracy and this pandemic in Africa has been completely fascinating. When you watch sort of the way it's intersected with elections, in some cases postponing elections, in some cases giving incumbents a reason to dramatically constrain political space for opponents in a run-up to an election. So it's a complex relationship where the pandemic itself is having some pretty negative effects on democratic governance on the continent.
And I would just add to that, you know, in Latin America, there's such diversity in terms of performance. It really would be hard to generalize as to whether or not the system of government is to blame. Because I would say that for every democracy that has succeeded, there's an autocracy somewhere on the planet that's failing in responding to the COVID-19 crisis. And in Latin America, I would point to Venezuela, which is, again, a contender for probably worst performance on dealing with the pandemic. Venezuela was an unmitigated disaster prior to the advent of COVID-19. You know, it was facing an unprecedented humanitarian and public health crisis, with more than 5 million people displaced across international borders, another 8 million people displaced internally. 6 out of every 10 hospitals prior to the pandemic did not have consistent running water or electricity. And mind you, this is once the wealthiest country in South America. And so now you have Maduro and the Maduro government or regime that is spurning COVAX contributions over the potential risks of AstraZeneca, and is instead using his public platform to encourage the use of homeopathic solutions for dealing with the pandemic at the sort of the community level. Likewise, I look to Cuba, which has a fairly well-known and well-respected public health system, but it really is having a difficult time getting a handle on the crisis, and we're seeing numbers in Cuba spike. And moreover, Cuba is trying to release its own vaccine, but is unable to keep up with the pace of other countries that are developing competitor vaccines. And so, you know, when I think more broadly about the question of authoritarianism and whether or not authoritarianism is a political system that is better equipped to deal with a pandemic, I asked, you know, why have some autocracies succeeded and why have some failed? And I think the major difference could potentially be populism. In consolidated and solidly authoritarian systems, you don't really need as much buy-in from your public to pursue a course of action or impose a certain number of policies. But in a region like Latin America, where we have any number of wannabe authoritarians or populist authoritarians, or you know, these are individuals who still have to operate within the constraints of a democratic system. And so that requires that they seek public input and consensus for what they're doing. And so I would agree with Michelle that sort of these less secure democracies might feel threatened by public health authorities, which is why we're seeing the denigration of common sense public health measures by so many of these populist authoritarians.
Some excellent points. And one thread I'd like to pull on a little bit is one of the characteristics of sort of authoritarian strongman leaders that I've always found fascinating is their ability to capitalize on crises, to consolidate power, to create a common enemy, to unite and consolidate, you know, support from the population. I'm thinking Vladimir Putin's ability to stay in power over the last 20 odd years. So why has it been we have seen some authoritarian leaders respond so well and embrace this crisis with the pandemic, and some fail so miserably to do so?
Well, I'll give it a stab. I think, it really does come back to what we just discussed with state capacity, right? So not every authoritarian has a really capable state at their disposal to, pull the levers and make things happen. So you can have all the bluster in the world, but if beneath it, you can't move out on a public health response and protect people, it sort of a charismatic leadership style is going to be insufficient. So what you've seen in Africa is less a capacity on the part of leaders with authoritarian leanings to sort of mobilize support by convincing everyone that they are going to lead kind of the glorious battle against the hidden enemy of coronavirus, and much more an opportunistic kind of power grab where either it's, in Zimbabwe, some corrupt deals around PPE and medical equipment that have helped to enrich key members of the inner circle, or in Uganda and their recent elections, right? A set of excuses, again, for closing the political space available to opponents. And so it's less about growing your base of support and making that tent bigger, and more kind of about manipulating the opportunities present in a really extraordinary situation.
Yeah, I agree with Michelle. That when we talk about the authoritarian states, well, their state capacity actually varies, right, from strong to weak, right? So you have like authoritarian countries, some of them like Xi Jinping's China, Putin's Russia. They're very powerful. In case of China, that I think is even more facilitated by the rise, what I call the bandwagon politics. When you have all the influential political resources concentrated in one superordinate actor, in this case, President Xi, right? And then you have all those lower level officials basically look to him as a bellwether, whatever he said, that they're going to actually jump onto his policy bandwagon, to show they are the early and enthusiastic supporter of his policy agenda. So that actually create a situation, make a policy implementation enforcement easier, right, in the pandemic response.
Yeah, and I would just add that in the instance of populists, what we're seeing a lot in Latin America is that populists are taking advantage of the pandemic to try to shore up their electoral base for oncoming elections. And so I would point to President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador, for instance, as somebody who is a master in terms of his manipulation and use of social media and manicuring his public image, but was also somebody who sealed off El Salvador's borders, shut down air traffic between El Salvador and Asia more than a month before most other countries of the Americas decided to do so. And he got a lot of credit for that from his population. But El Salvador as well is a country that it was especially vulnerable to the economic shocks that were associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so Bukele was somebody who oversaw the administration of massive subsidies to over 1.4 million families in the country. And so going into legislative elections that were held in El Salvador last month, Bukele won an overwhelming majority because he was able to take advantage of the context that was provided by the pandemic to engage in more transactional or clientelistic behaviors.
Certainly. And I think going down a different path, I'd like to explore this idea a little bit, but sort of what trends can we observe besides those at the national governmental level action that have come from this pandemic?
Well, I would pick up on the point that I was just making about El Salvador. El Salvador has long been in the news for being one of the most dangerous countries in the world. But over the past year, 2020, we saw El Salvador's homicide rate plummeted. There's a lot of suspicion as to whether or not President Bukele has engaged in some sort of behind closed doors negotiation with the MS-13, which is one of the largest and most violent gangs operating in the region. But nonetheless, I would just point to the broader notion that organized crime as a non-state actor has been forced to adapt and flex in the face of this pandemic. Initially, we saw throughout Central America, we saw major economic contraction. We saw a significant reduction in remittances from the United States, which for countries like Honduras and El Salvador comprise about 20% of their national GDPs. And so although the remittance flows have rebounded as the US economy proved more resilient than initial projections may have suggested, we've seen that organized crime groups, which had long become accustomed to extortion of the communities where they operate, started to diversify their activities and started to extend their influence over communities by filling the gaps that were left by an absent or under-resourced state. So it was organized crime groups that were administering PPE to needy populations, administering humanitarian foodstuffs, even in the wake of back-to-back Category 5 hurricanes that plummeted Central America in the fall. And likewise, at the early stages of the pandemic, it was gangs throughout Latin America that were enforcing lockdowns in communities that were especially vulnerable and didn't have access to public health. Likewise, we saw that because extortion was down, many of the organized crime groups and gangs, and particularly in Central America, increased their activities in things like drug and human smuggling across borders. And this plays into the earlier point that Michelle made about misinformation. There was a lot of misinformation, and there continues to be a lot of misinformation being pushed by organized crime groups and smuggling groups in Central America about US border policy. And likely, I think that's a response to the dips that they saw in their revenue flows. They've been forced to diversify their activities in that regard. And likewise, I would say that organized crime groups have had a much easier time of recruiting people. In the face of economic downturn, we always sort of see this, that organized crime and gangs, they tend to increase their recruitment because there's a ready population of people who aren't employed and certainly aren't employed in the formal economy. Likewise, throughout Latin America, for most of 2020, 97% of the region's children or youth were not in school. And so we've seen an increase in gang recruitment of vulnerable children in poor communities. Those circumstances have just created a real boon for organized crime, and governments that are already trying to get a handle on the pandemic have really had a difficult time of staying one step ahead of these organized crime and gang organizations.
Yeah, I like to follow up this issue of misinformation and disinformation. I think this is indeed a major concern in this pandemic, right? In part because we have, being facing this novel virus, even today, we still a lot of unknowns. We know how, uncertainty, leaves doors open to all kinds of, rumors, conspiracy theories, right? This is exactly what happened in the United States and China, essentially within weeks of the pathogen's appearance, right? Social media in both countries lit up with suggestions, that the virus was a biological weapon, right? Either created a Chinese lab or one that it was produced by the United States, right? The Fort Detrick, as a Chinese, the social media would suggest, that, unfortunately, but you don't have, you would expect like World Health Organization or any, like public health agencies just came out to say, well, this is not true. Well, this is, but, it's, I think this raises a very important issue on global health governance, that how should we develop those norms, right, to dispel, this myth, to combat the conspiracy theories or rumors, that it really hurting, the international response to the outbreak. To some extent, that the rumor, this facilitated, by, promoted at the official level, by, like the governments on both sides, right? We know that even just today, I saw this, the interview is the former U.S. CDC director, right? He was still promoting that theory of a lab escape, from Wuhan, even though there's no evidence to substantiate that. And in China, they still point to the U.S. military labs, as a concern, right? Because this is sometimes you find this logically not consistent because the WHO team in China already said this is extremely unlikely for a lab escape. But if that is extremely unlikely, but why do you still imply the U.S. lab in Fort Detrick, right, is the possible origin of the pandemic, right?
So I just want to jump in real quick and go back to the premise of your question about kind of moving beyond the kind of national level state actors, because Paul made such interesting points about organized crime at going in a completely different direction. One of the trends we've seen actually is a more assertive kind of trans-African interjection into the global conversation about this pandemic. So very early on, you saw the African Union speaking with a clear voice, appointing high-level envoys and dispatching them around the world to talk about some of the really important economic issues that were going to affect Africa, particularly debt relief. Very clear plans being articulated for what should be done at the international financial institutions to create space. You had the Africa CDC doing regular calls so that the continent was sharing information. And we all recall, well, there's still so much we don't know, but we all recall those early days, right, where information was incredibly hard to come by. And they did a really extraordinary job, actually, of kind of transcending national boundaries and finding some solidarity and a common position on issues that were of interest throughout the continent.
Certainly excellent points. I'd like to shift gears a little bit now towards some more targeted questions towards your areas of expertise. So Dr. Angelo, I'd love to start with you. So we've spoken about it a lot. Central and South America have seemed to have been hit disproportionately hard by this pandemic. So would you just please elaborate a little bit on what may be the sort of drivers as to why they have seen such a disproportionate impact? Is it, socioeconomic factors? Is it a culture factor? What is driving this?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the economy of Latin America, the regional GDP is the most significant regional economic contraction for 2020. But the region was also the most hard hit in absolute terms, based on the data that we have, the global data that we have on COVID cases and deaths. Despite comprising only 8% of the world's population, Latin America and the Caribbean represent some 17% of the known COVID cases in the world and some 27% of the world's known COVID deaths. And that's not including the underreporting that I previously mentioned that we're seeing in the second most populous country in the region, which is Mexico. And so, I think, under those circumstances, you have to ask, what is it about Latin America that has left people so vulnerable? And I would point to a couple of things. Firstly, you have many of the countries in Latin America are middle-income countries, but they have the effective tax rates in these countries is significantly lower than other middle-income countries around the world. So these are countries that already are investing significantly less in social services or reinvesting significantly less in the human capital of their populations. Likewise, we see across Latin America and the Caribbean, and particularly in places like Central America, that the vast majority of people in the region are employed in the informal economy. In places like El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, that more than 70% of these populations are employed in the informal economy, which means that they don't have access to protections or access to employer-provided health insurance. And so in the face of a pandemic, that creates a really significant strain on a public health system that is already under-resourced. Likewise, I would just say in economic terms, we saw that Latin America and the Caribbean over the past 2 decades had really made significant strides in lifting people out of poverty, tens of millions of people out of poverty. But much of that growth was underpinned by interest, particularly on part of China and the United States, in extractive industries. And now in the face of the pandemic, we've seen a lack of real global consumption of some of the industries that had underpinned the success of the region for so long. And during that period of economic growth, we didn't see any long-term investments in social services in many of these countries. And so it's produced a really, really bad scenario, and it's going to be very difficult for the region to rebound from. In the past year, since the beginning of the pandemic, more than 22 million people across the region have slid below the poverty line. And there are 34 million people more unemployed in Latin America today than there were last year. So, I think it's a pretty comprehensive picture across the board that Latin America hasn't really made the kind of long-term investments in its people that it needs to. And hopefully the region will learn something from its experience during this pandemic.
Certainly. And switching gears a little bit, this next question is directed towards you, Ambassador Gavin. We've seen such a poor response from sort of lower middle income countries in Latin America, then turning towards Africa, at least initially. You had mentioned they had seen some response with great success. So would you just elaborate a little bit on what may have enabled that success, at least early on?
Absolutely. So I think it was a combination of factors. First, really, and most importantly, is the continent's experience with infectious disease control. So most famously Ebola, but Ebola is by no means the only infectious disease that African public health systems have been working to control for quite some time. So these are states that are actually have protocols in place, have people who are experienced in using them, understand the importance of rapid reporting, which I think helped lead to that great information sharing that we saw early on. And that are also really, really good at getting public health messages and community health workers out to remote areas. So they were able to kind of rely on this experience and infrastructure. Then I think, there is the demographic point. Africa is the youngest region in the world, demographically speaking, right? You've got a lot of societies where the vast majority are even under 18. And we know that young people are able to resist the virus and clear it more easily than the elderly. There's also, there's something to be said for climate. People do spend a lot of time outside in lots of parts of the continent, and that does help, as we all know now, right, in terms of exposure. So there were a number of kind of factors that may have helped the first wave to be less devastating. But again, the numbers are significantly worse now in the second wave. And when you look at the places that are hardest hit, and there's no place on the continent hit worse than South Africa, it's really kind of counterintuitive, right? You have one of the most capable and well-resourced states on the continent suffering terribly in terms of the actual health outcomes and the economic outcomes. South Africa, just in the first half of last year, lost 2.2 million jobs. This is a country where employment is kind of the central animating political force. So it's an absolutely devastating situation. A variant has developed there that is particularly virulent, and vaccine rollout is moving very slowly. So it's for everything I've had to say about state capacity, and the South African state, imperfect like every state, but in a relative sense is quite capable. It hasn't been enough in the face of this virus.
Certainly. And then pivoting towards the Pacific, Dr. Huang, I have a question for you. So we've talked a lot about China's early success in sort of containing this virus at home, but in what ways have they been able to utilize this pandemic to sort of expand their influence and the reach abroad?
Well, yeah, I think China's comparative success in addressing the pandemic and certainly gave its leaders more confidence, but in foreign policy arena, right? It's emboldened to take a more assertive approach, right? Over the issues, like Taiwan, and even for what China considered domestic issues, like Hong Kong and Xinjiang, right? It also tried to sell off its success story internationally, right? Through this so-called mask diplomacy, then vaccine diplomacy, right? By providing medical supplies, right, to countries that are still reeling from the pandemic. So I pointed out in a recent piece, that by early February, just the three Chinese vaccine makers, Sinopharm, Sinovac, and CanSino, they had received overseas orders, for more than 572 million doses. That accounts for nearly 8% of the all doses on the contract globally. If we only include those low and middle income countries, this share is much larger, right? If you let's look at Indonesia, right, the Sinovac alone supply 38% of the nearly 330 million doses the country has secured, right? So that success by that China's vaccine diplomacy in particular is indeed generating goodwill, help China projecting soft power. It also helped it for to implement that Belt and Road Initiative, the signature and foreign policy initiative in the 21st century. As we know that the BRI was sort of in trouble, because of the disruption of the supply chain. But they hope that this vaccine diplomacy is going to revitalize that project. In the meantime, right, that you have seen a different story, right, in the OECD countries, right? The wealthy nations do not seem to take China's approach or that well, right? There's essential reputation loss, right? When China's soft power is concerned, right? If you look at this Pew Research survey, right, that I think was conducted last year, they found, that in the United States, by 73% of Americans, view China as negative. That is the highest level since 2005. In fact, in almost all the there's 14 the countries surveyed, right? Around 3/4 or more, see China in a negative light, right? And even in the some of the developing countries, China's vaccine diplomacy has not been faring well, right? Southeast Asia, that is considered as priority of the country's vaccine diplomacy. But according to a survey conducted by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, even though China is rated as the region's #1 provider of vaccine, in terms of medical supplies to the region, right? Only 17% of the respondents consider China a trusted power, right, in the region, compared with 20% for India and 48% for the United States. In fact, in between 2020 and 2021, we actually saw the trust in China fail. That the government leaders actually there, eager to see the United States playing a more proactive role in the region, in global vaccine distribution and administration. So U.S. now is entering this game of practicing vaccine diplomacy, by recently working with Japan, Australia, India to supply 1 billion doses of vaccines to the region. That is expected to further dilute China's gain in vaccine diplomacy. So just again, like its diplomatic success, if any, remains very mixed, even with the comparative success of China's pandemic control story.
Certainly, thank you for those insights. And we're coming up on our time here, but just briefly before we close, I'd like to offer you all the opportunity to leave us with some brief closing remarks.
I'll start. Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's been illuminating to listen to my colleagues and think about the way that this plays out in different parts of the world and all the different kind of levels and dimensions to this crisis. Often, I think in the foreign policy community that we inhabit, we are seeing some of this solely through the lens of geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China. Certainly, a lot of folks looking at Africa are seeing it through this lens. But I do think that allowing for differentiation, a little more granularity, a little more specificity, when you look at the way different African states have responded to this, what it tells us actually is incredibly rich. It's well worth looking at. And the one thing I would want to leave people with, in addition to making sure they understand the magnitude of the problem of vaccine access, which is tremendous and has to be addressed, the magnitude of the economic challenge, right, which has to be addressed. But what this tells us actually about who is trusted and who is not in various societies, I think is hugely illuminating in the African context, and people who care about influence and about understanding the direction of a given country should be looking very closely at whose voice is being amplified and trusted in this moment of crisis when people are looking for sources of leadership and information.
Yeah, firstly, I would just like to reiterate what Michelle said and extend my thanks for the invitation to join you. For those of you who are watching this, I myself was on the NAFAC staff for 4 years, and I was a midshipman at the Naval Academy. So it's really nice to be on the other side now and to be able to participate and contribute to the good work that you're all doing. So congratulations for putting on such a wonderful conference and for bringing this panel together. I would just also offer, and this is not something that sort of came up in the conversation, but vaccine access in Latin America has also significantly lagged behind. And there are countries in the region that will not see widespread vaccine availability until 2023. And so to the extent that the United States and other major powers in the world can surge vaccines to public health authorities, many of which, as Michelle has stated on a couple of occasions and throughout this panel, have significant experience in dealing with sort of low-grade epidemics, viral epidemics. I think the sooner the region can rebound in economic and human security terms. So I would sort of end my presentation with those remarks and just reiterate my thanks for inviting me to participate today.
I also want to echo Paul and Michelle by thank you, Andrew, for organizing the event, and also thanks for inviting me to participate in the panel. I think if this COVID-19 can reveal anything, it's that this problem of this lack of core disease surveillance and response capacity, poor national governance, it's certainly not just a problem, confined to the developing world, right? We saw, what happened in the United States, right? So these issues are actually also major concerns, right, in the developer world. And also, if we look at the trajectory of the disease spread, right, where it started, right, the disruption of the global supply chain, the prominence of the, vaccine diplomacy, that suggested that China, is playing a central role to global health security. Its role to the global, supply chain and the COVID's epidemiological pattern, notwithstanding, this deteriorating Sino-U.S. relations, it could so easily paralyze, UN response to the pandemic, prevent it from issuing a resolution or creating a subsidiary, right, to effectively cope with the outbreak. I found it's just so perplexing, if you will. And many liberal democracies' failure in handling the outbreak, the comparative success of China's, this top-down authoritarian approach, encouraged China to promote the so-called system advantages, right, in challenging, this, liberal international order. So, I think that might suggest that, another battlefield in great power in a competition in the future, where that is this competition between democracies and authoritarianism. Our boss Richard Haas like to say, right, this pandemic, has not reshaped history; it only accelerated it. But I think maybe time will tell well whether this path rupture we have observed is just an aberration, or something more permanent. So with that, I will stop there.
Certainly, I think time certainly will tell. But as for now, again, thank you on behalf of both the United States Naval Academy and the Naval Academy's Foreign Affairs Conference for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Your contribution, the contribution your thoughts make and your perspectives make a monumental contribution to this conference. So we wish you all the best, and thank you very much.